We are ready for verses. We are ready for verses. Yes, for verses. We are ready to begin the new verses. We are ready to begin the new verses. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. But we just need to make sure that everything is goat versus fish. That everything is goat versus fish. Yes, we have goat versus fish. We have goat versus fish. Celebration for this new verses of goat versus fish. We are here in the new mighty verses. And we thought, well, goat versus fish. We had a long verses last verses. 10 hours of goat versus fish. But it is the beginning of the new verses, and we cannot just begin the new verses without the mighty verses, without having the mighty verses. We need to have a mighty verses. So here comes goat versus fish. New verses, yes, forgotten virtue, yes. Welcome to goat versus fish. Welcome to the new verses of goat versus fish. It is a new beginning for goat versus fish. It is a new beginning for goat versus fish. Why? Just look at this verses. Look at these verses. There is nothing to be seen. There's nothing to know. There's nothing to do. There's nothing to show. Apart from goat versus fish and goat and fish and bits. But we need to have a new verses. We just need to have this new verses. But because goat versus fish, we are going to just sing you into the new verses, one final verses. Goat! Celebration for goat! Forgotten virtue declares goat. Before goat versus fish could even begin to sing the verses, it was goat. Celebration, faux show games, celebration. Fence-bot now telling goat versus fish. The host with the most faux show games is now celebration, is now hosting goat versus fish. Wow! This is truly the beginning of a new verses. And it begins with forgotten virtue declaring goat. It begins with forgotten virtue declaring goat. Who would have thought that the verse of 2,200,221 was going to be beginning with forgotten virtue declaring goat? It is celebration for goat. It's celebration for goat. Yes, that is a goat. First new goat of the verses. Look at it, know it, see it, learn it, hear it. That is goat. That is forgotten virtue. The goat. Fish. Fish beware. This isn't verse-miss anymore. This isn't the celebration of a unity of a goat and a fish. No, this is verses. Now. It is goat versus fish. And it begins with a goat. Fish. You better get your verses. You better get your verses of goat versus fish. Because otherwise it's just going to be goat all the verses. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish, yes. Look into the verses of goat versus fish. It is beginning again. It is the new beginning of the new start of the new end of goat versus fish. Celebration for goat versus fish. Celebration for goat versus fish. But once more, just to ring in the new verses for one final verses. Should older verses be forgot and never brought to mind? Should old fence-sitters finally get off and choose goat or fish kind? So choose a goat or fish, my fence, so choose a goat or fish. We'll take a cup of verses yet for all goat and fish kind. Mighty verses, everyone. Celebration, fence-bot with the celebration. AMC with Team Goat. Rabbit manatees with hello goat versus fish. It is becoming the mighty verses. Yes, we thought, goat versus fish. We had such a long verses, 10 hours of goat versus fish to bring in the mighty verses. And then we thought, we could just, give you the rest of goat versus fish. But then we thought, we need verses. It is the first verses of the new verses. And goat versus fish is here to bring you that verses. Celebration, Velo Infinity with the celebration. Rabbit manatees with hello goat versus fish. Fence-bot with the celebration. Slur jaded with hello. Forgotten virtue with goat versus fish. Goat versus fish in 20,000,000,021. Oh, this is going to be fun. Goat versus Fish in the verses of 20,220,021. The verse just begun. The goat will forever still versus the fish. Did you think it was going to be? Did you think it was going to be any different? Oh, that would be an affront to Goat versus Fish. So, verse as long as you wish with Goat versus Fish. With Goat versus Fish. Live on the Twitch, live on the YouTube, and the Book of Faces, and in so many goat and fish places. Ooh, we love to see all of your faces, we love to see all of your faces, and by faces we mean that next to your name, Rabbit Manatees, for verses, you can see something there. There's something that is there, and we can see a face of forgotten virtue, and Velo Infinity with the celebration, Velo Infinity, and MCC, and Merry Versemas from Obscure Nerd VR, from Obscure Nerd VR, from Obscure Nerd VR. From Obscure Nerd VR. If you think the Goat vs. Fish has gone far on the Twitch, you should see Obscure Nerd VR. On its channel on the YouTube, it recently passed 5 quadrillion verses, 5 quadrillion views of its glitchy AF sort of virtual stuff. Know that fence-sitting gamers not had quite enough. When your virtual hooves and your virtual fins. Oh, Goat versus Fish, oh, the virtual hooves and the virtual fins. Oh, they're glitching about, they're glitching about, oh, they're glitching about. Ferns. It is still the fence-demic. It is still the fence-demic. Fences all over the Goat and Fish, all within the Goat and Fish, and surrounding all of the place. Fence. You'll have no fun in 221. You'll have no fun in 221. Fence. You will have no fun in 221. Fence. This is Goat 1. This is Goat 1 coming in on the fence. Goat 1 coming in on the fence. Rabbit Manatees with 100 bits for Goat versus Fish. Celebration for Rabbit Manatees for 100 bits for Goat versus Fish. And it is a versus in space. It is a versus in space. Goat and Fish. Goat versus Fish. Goat Fish. Goat versus Fish. Goat Fish. Goat versus Fish. This is Goat 1. We are approaching the fence. We just have to get in that slight gap in the fence posts, and then we can drop the verses, and we will destroy the fence. Oh no, it's a fence fighter. It's a fence fighter. Oh no. Shooting fence posts at the goat. No. We're going to approach. We are approaching the goat. We are going to make it sit on us. Oh, it just grazed the goat. We're having trouble here. I do not know how long we can maintain it. The fence is gaining. Goat versus a fish. Oh no! It does nothing. What? The fence? The fence was about to make me sit on it. What happened? What happened? What happened? How could we possibly have evaded that fence? This is Fish. This is Fish 14. Fish 14. We got your versus Goat. We got your versus Goat. Now let's get in there and let's destroy that fence. Oh, I never thought I'd see the versus where I'd be thanking Fish, but Fish came into the last versus. We have found it. We have found it. We have found it. Oh, wait. I don't think. Oh, no. I do not think I have the confidence. I don't think I have the confidence. I do not think I have the confidence to destroy the fence. I do not think. No. Perhaps I cannot do it. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Oh, is that goat versus fish? Yes. Use the verses, Goat. Use the verses, Goat. Yes, I must let the verses guide me. And the goat was approaching to drop the verses on the fence. The goat was approaching to drop the verses on the fence. But what happened next? Let us go to the poll. Let us go to the Twitch polls. We need to know what happened next. We need to know what happens next in this verses. Goat versus fish. We need to know what happens next in the verses. To the polls on the Twitterverse. /poll. What happened next? Yes, that is the question. Yes, what happened next? Will it be? Yes, if you have things to shout out, you have things you want to happen next. You can tell Goat versus Fish. Double versus 1 week until Goat versus Fish is on my podcast. This is not offense. No, that is a true versus. Yes, on January 9, Velo Infinity Podcast will be hosting Goat versus Fish at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Follow Velo Infinity now. Do it now. Goat versus Fish implores you to follow it now. Celebration. Goat versus Fish. Read right. Hello, everyone. Happy verses. Yes. FenceBot still on the fence. Oh, fenciness. MCC versus. Hello, versus to you, MCC. Yes. So what shall happen in the verses? What shall happen next? Shall it be Goat fires versus into fence, or shall it be Goat stops? Oh no, not Goat. The fish. Fish stops Goat at the last verses. Fish stops Goat because Goat versus Fish. Or shall it be because Goat versus Fish? Or shall it be fence stands tall? The duration of the poll is 5 minutes. 5 minutes. The poll has begun. If you need to refresh your verses, when we left Goat was about to drop the verses, and it used the power of Goat versus Fish, to give it the confidence to drop the verses. But drop the verses on the fence. But what shall happen next? Refresh your browser if you must. On the Twitch. That is where it be. It is on twitch.tv. Where you can participation in the poll. To determine what happens next in Fence Wars. Or was it Starverse? Oh, Goat versus Fish. What do they call that versus again? Twitch.tv/Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Now, Goat versus Fish has resolution. Goat versus Fish has resolution. This versus. We are going to stay looking at that Twitch. Because we need to look at the Twitch to see the poll, and we will not let another poll pass by the verses of Goat versus Fish. Yes, when we ask you for bits and we ask you for verses, if you wish to participate in the poll, we need to be there for you. We need to respect your verses. And because Goat versus Fish is now looking so much more closely at the Twitch, we can see the redemption. Velo Infinity redeemed a song of Fish Center Live. Yes, we shall sing a song of Fish Center Live. We will be watching the verses As we sing a song of Fish Center Live, we believe we can do it. We believe with the new verses of Goat versus Fish, this is a possible versus. Anything is possible with Goat versus Fish. So let us bring up Fish Center Live. Let's bring up Fish Center Live. Goat versus Fish. Let us bring up Fish Center Live. Goat versus Fish. And then we shall see Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. We have almost completely learned the verses. Now, let us try this versus. Goat versus Fish. Speaking of fish, Rabbit Manatees, I was going to go live in an hour or two, Goat versus Fish. Perhaps we will raid you. Perhaps we will raid you, Rabbit Manatees. Yes, this versus goes out to Velo Infinity, who wants a song of Fish Center Live. Winchester Fence Sitter, you're bringing me down. You sat and did nothing as the verses left town. You could have done something, but you didn't try. You didn't choose goat or fish. You let the verses go by. Now everyone knows just how much I needed that goat. It wouldn't have gone so far away if you'd only started choosing a fish. Oh, Fish Center Live, oh, where have you gone? You're not live on Adult Swim no more, but Goat versus Fish goes on. You really did something to stay on the air. You really tried. But when along came the fence of AT&T, it stuck right in your behind. Now everyone knows just how much we needed that show. But now at least we have Rabbit Manatees on the Twitch who has a fish tank of fish for you to watch after this Winchester Fence Sitter. You're bringing me down. We were watching Fish Center Live, and then the verses left town. The poll is almost done. The poll is almost done. And we are looking at the poll now. And it is a 3 versus tie between Goat fires versus into Fence. We have 81 versus. Fish stops Goat because Goat versus Fish. 87 versus. And Fence stands tall with 85 versus. This is anyone's versus. We need to get in the vote. We need to get in the vote. To vote in the poll. Heckin' Random says Goat. Well, how many channels is this streaming on? It is streaming on. Well, it's on the Goat versus Fish YouTube. It is on the Goat versus Fish Book of Faces. And it is on the Goat versus Fish Twitch. And there are maybe perhaps 1 or 2 that are hosting Goat versus Fish. Yes, so there you are, Heckin' Random, Heckin' Random. Are you goat or fish, Heckin' Random? Are you goat or fish? Goat channel celebration, and here comes the verses. Is it a 3-way verses? No. Goat fires versus into Fence wins with 88 verses. What are you trying to say? No. Oh, it is a tie versus. It is a tie versus between Fish stops Goat, because Goat versus Fish and Fence stands tall. Oh my verses with 97 verses each. It is a tie versus. 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 Ooh, tie versus. Yes, you like that. Yes. Yes, some would call it the tie fighter. Goat versus Fish. Yes, Heckin' Random, this is an auction, LOL. Well, we want to see how it goes. You resub for a Goat. Redeem. Jason TZ has redeemed a verse. Jason TZ has redeemed a verse. And Goat versus Fish. And Velo Infinity is hosting. And FenceBot, did you tell us? Yes, it is. It is subscription. Jason TZ the Goat. Jason TZ the Goat. Did subscribe to Goat versus Fish again. It's renewed its subscription again. Celebration for Jason TZ. Celebration for subscription. Jason TZ is a mighty goat. Yes, so we need to know. Goat versus Fish. We need to know goat versus fish. We get back in the verses. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Yes, we are here. Goat channel, Heckin' Random says goat channel. Redeem goat versus fish. You bid $1, said Heckin' Random. Celebration for Heckin' Random, who Heckin' randomly showed up in the stream of goat versus fish. Celebration. We need to count goat and fish. Do not despair. We do not despair. Goat versus fish. Yes, we shall run the new poll. What is your commandments, Lord? Are you goat or are you fish? Choose goat or fish. That is the commandment of goat versus fish. Only because you asked to be commanded by goat versus fish. Goat versus fish does not normally command you to choose goat or fish, but because you have asked for the commandment, we command you and only you, Heckin' Random, to choose goat or fish. Heckin' Random chose fish. Celebration for fish. What is your commandment? Choose goat or fish, and it was fish. Heckin' Random, you just stopped by to say hi. You didn't know where, you didn't know why. But this Heckin' Random, Heckin' Random, when asked the one true question, it chose a fish, even right after MCC the goats chose a goat. Chose a goat. Oh, Heckin' Random, you've got verses cut out for you. Did you think that this would just be a celebration of fish because you chose fish? Oh. But what could be a greater celebration of fish than a goat to verses? To MCC goat to verses. Cod has an awesome beard. The cod head fish. Celebration. So yes, we shall new poll. There was a tie in the poll. So we are just going to have to have running off poll. What shall happen? And that is the question. Goat versus fish. So much to be doing. Oh, we should have looked at the poll and we should have tried to read the contribution to see who contributed, and we shout out the ones who contributed to the most to the poll. And goat versus fish was so fixated on trying to find out what did happen in the poll that we did not have the verses to read that verses. But goat versus fish. Remember goat versus fish. Remember to read the ones who make the contribution to the poll. Celebration. Next verses. Always trying to improve the verses. So it was between a tie verses between Fence Stands Tall and Fish Stops Goat, because goat versus fish. And you could see how these could seem to be the same verses. But we assure you they are not. Goat versus fish. The new poll begins now. Same verses, 5 minutes of verses, but now the goat fires the verses, is not on the verses. Now we just have fish stops goat because goat versus fish, and we have Fence Stands Tall. Photo pie is possible. Goat versus fish. We do not know. No, we do not think that is versible. Well, anything is versible in goat versus fish, but we are wondering, are you telling goat versus fish to sit on the fence? We are thinking you are telling goat versus fish to sit on the fence. Goat versus fish. That is what we are thinking of goat versus fish. Goat versus fish? Goat versus fish? Goat versus fish is too on the ball for you. Goat versus fish. Moderation! We demand moderation. Yes, you are going to get the verses. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. You are lucky that you are here to watch goat versus fish, having to learn the moderation, because you are getting to stay here much longer than you may think. Goat versus fish. Let us see. Goat versus fish. Yes, we want moderation. We want the view of the moderation. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Goat. The Comedy Store says goat. The Comedy Store says goat. The Comedy Store says goat. Forget moderation. We need to have recognition of the Comedy Store. Oh. versus Fish at the Comedy Store. Oh, who could ask for anything more? Tony Hinchcliffe said Goat versus Fish won't last 3 months. And Brian Breadbasket did join in the fun. But if you are looking for something new under the sun, and ask the sun you never had, if it was goat or if it was fish. If it was goat or fish. And in the verse of 2,000,000,2021, it is still goat versus fish. It is still goat versus fish. Yes, that is right. The Comedy Store Los Angeles. It is still goat versus fish. It is still lots of goat versus fish. And if you wish, Goat versus Fish could once again become part of the Comedy Store Los Angeles. We could cross our verses. And we could make a very powerful verses on the Twitch. Oh, yes, yes. Look how they are here for Goat versus Fish. Look how they are here for Goat versus Fish. This could be your verses. This could be your verses. Said Goat versus Fish. Let us celebration. Follow the Comedy Store Los Angeles. Follow the Comedy Store Los Angeles. Follow the Comedy Store as it declares goat. The Comedy Store declared goat. The Comedy Store declared goat. What Goat versus Fish? The Comedy Store declared goat. Wow, what a declaration of the Comedy Store. We did not know the Comedy Store would ever choose goat. Celebration or fish. We knew that it welcomed Goat versus Fish for verses, but yes. The Comedy Store. Look, it is goat. Look, it is goat. The Comedy Store. Ha ha ha. Oh, it is laughing all about. It is laughing all about. It is the Comedy Store versus. There you are. You are among your fellow goat. You are among your fellow goat. Oh, Goat versus Fish. We need to check the poll. Goat versus Fish. Ooh, it looks like 8 verses for Fish stops Goat, because Goat versus Fish. Only 1 versus for the fence standing tall. It is still anyone's verses. And now back to the verses. We need to count Goat and Fish. We need to count Goat and Fish. Let us see. Goat versus Fish. Oh, really lost its marbles. No, it is just that you are beginning to understand that it is Goat versus Fish. Yes, heckin' random. Cod with the fish. Heckin' random with the fish. There you are, heckin' random. It is fish for you. It is fish for you. Cod is the best. Goat versus Fish. Your friend has performed there, and so has Goat versus Fish. You could say, it could be recognition, appreciation from the comedy places. Yes, back before the fence-demic, you could go to a comedy place and you could actually see Goat versus Fish, and you could say, wow, this comedy place, ha ha ha, it is humorous, just like Goat versus Fish. Yes, it is a place of Goat versus Fish. But now, because of the fence-demic, they're getting all fancy and Goat versus Fish. Oh, yeah, you cannot have Goat versus Fish. Yes, you see, if it weren't for the fence-demic, Goat versus Fish would be at the Comedy Store every verses. Oh, it would be every verses, headlining the verses at the Comedy Store Los Angeles. It would just be Goat versus Fish. But it is really just the fence-demic that is preventing it from being Goat versus Fish. Yes, that is the only fence in this verses. Goat versus Fish. Let us see. The vote is about to happen. Goat versus Fish. And it is Fish stops Goat because Goat versus Fish. Fish stops Goat becomes Goat versus Fish. The fish stops the goat because Goat versus Fish. And Rabbit Manatees contributed 3 bits. 3 bits to the verses. Celebration. Oh, there are so many verses to do, so many verses to be, so many verses to see. Goat versus Fish. Yes, we will change the verses. So it is Goat versus Fish. Yes, we need to get back into the verses. Yes. But we also need to shout out. S-S-O. S-O. Goat versus Fish. No, we'll just make a new follow. Take a versus Goat versus Fish. It's going to be Goat versus Fish. Ah, Goat versus Fish. Let us see now. Twitch.tv/ the Goat versus Fish. Oh, stop with your fanciness. False verses. Goat versus Fish. Goat and fish and goatfish. Goat versus Fish. Goat and fish and fish. Goatfish. Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Go and follow the Comedy Store on the Twitch. Go and follow the Comedy Store if you want so much more than Goat versus Fish. How could you possibly want more than Goat versus Fish? Raw cod meat is sushi. Raw cod meat is sushi. Goat raw meat sounds nasty. And well, that is a versus. That is a versus. That is a mighty versus. And it is the ape face. I mean, you smell nice today. Yes, it is the smell. Smell goat versus fish. Yes, it is goat versus fish. Smello versus. Yes, smell the versus of goat versus fish. Oh, the goat versus fish. Yes, you can just have a little goat versus fish and just let the sea of the fish shower upon you and say, feeling very goat versus fish. You just wake up in the verses and you say, I am feeling so goat versus fish. I just feel like I could go out there and versus that fish. And then the goat is coming out to the verses saying, what a versus. I just had a nice versus. Now we can go out there and we can versus the goat. And you can versus the fish and you can versus the goat. And then the goat and fish come to verses and then the goat and fish come to verses. And then it goes as this. And then the goat says, oh, good morning, fish. And then the fish says, oh, goat, there is no good or evil, only goat and fish. And then you can hear the fence sitter laughing, going, ah, ha, 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 ha. You hear them laughing, but you cannot see the fence sitter. You just hear them laughing from beyond the verses. You wonder, how is the fence sitter here? And then the goat says, oh, fish, do you always have to have a fence so stuck up your butt? And then, ah, ha, 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 ha. They said, but goat versus fish, but goat versus fish. It is such a humorous verses. And then fish said, so going off to versus the fish this versus? And goat said, yes, I was just going off to versus the fish. I versus more fish than you ever versus goat. And then fish said, yes, but you are trapped in the corporate fence-scape. Well, I am an artistic fish, so even though you make more verses than me, I'm still a much more happier fish than you are goat. And then goat said, save it for the verses, save it for the verses. See you, goat, yes, see you, fish. And then goat goes off to the verses, and then it is situational comedic verses with goat versus fish. And then celebration. It is a celebration as this. It goes just like this. That is the celebration of the situational comedies of goat versus fish. Don't you want to see that versus? Don't you want to see that versus? Do farting cucumber receive celebration? Celebration! Celebration for goat versus fish. Celebration for goat versus fish. Celebration for goat versus fish. Yes, but now we need to continue the verses. Sad guitar strings, sad guitar strings, sad guitar strings. Sad guitar strings. What are the happy guitar strings like? Well, it would be more like. Sad. Happy. Which one is goat? Which one is fish? The Ape Face, the Comedy Store. I miss you guys. Oh, the Ape Face misses the Comedy Store Los Angeles, and so does Goat versus Fish. So does Goat versus Fish. Thank you, FenceBot. Thank you for following Goat versus Fish. Fart one, cool. Goat versus Fish. Well, thank you for following Goat versus Fish. Are you goat or are you fish? The Comedy Store, La Jolla equals fish. The Comedy Store, Hollywood equals goat. Wow, goat versus fish. We are learning so much about the Comedy Store Los Angeles, you know. Goat versus Fish would go to the Comedy Store Los Angeles, and we would just look at the Comedy Store Los Angeles, and we'd say, oh, Comedy Store Los Angeles, open up to Goat versus Fish. Open up to Goat versus Fish. We are giving you the full Goat versus Fish. We are giving you the full Goat versus Fish. We are giving you... No, Goat versus Fish. Stop blocking Goat versus... We are giving you the full Goat versus Fish. We are giving you the full Goat versus Fish. The Comedy Store. What more could you want? What more could you want? But in True Versus, they did welcome Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish recorded the Goat vs. Fish podcast at the Comedy Store Los Angeles. It was a place of Goat vs. Fish. And there was some. Goat vs. Fish is not going to name fence sitters. But Goat vs. Fish has heard that there were some who were looking at Goat vs. Fish at the Comedy Store Los Angeles, recording the Goat vs. Fish podcast, and they were saying, oh, Goat vs. Fish. How is it that Goat vs. Fish? How is it that they welcome Goat vs. Fish to this versus when I have been doing comedic verses for 1 billion verses, and then along comes Goat vs. Fish? Along comes Goat vs. Fish, just some sort of foolish verses with fences draped around it and walking around and just repeating Goat and Fish. Well, any fence sitter could do that verses. Any fence sitter could do that verses. We are not going to name Goat and Fish. We are not going to name Goat and Fish. We are not going to name Goat and Fish because Goat vs. Fish does not even know the names of those goat or fish, but they know the name of Goat vs. Fish. But they know the name of Goat vs. Fish. And if you want to versus Goat vs. Fish about it, well, you can't versus Goat vs. Fish about it because versus is for the goat and fish. Celebration for the Comedy Store Los Angeles. Celebration for the Comedy Store Los Angeles that welcomes Goat vs. Fish. And that Comedy Store documentation on Showtime really should have had more Candy Offman because we wanted to really know if it was goat or fish. Remember. There was James Courageous just standing there looking at the verses of Candy Offman at the Comedy Store Los Angeles, and there was barely even a verses. There was barely even a verses about Candy Offman if it was goat or fish. But it is right there, right when they enter the Comedy Store Los Angeles, they see Candy Offman, and so you must remember the Comedy Store Los Angeles. Remember that this is very Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish is a comedy. Oh yes, Goat vs. Fish is a tragedy. Yes, Goat vs. Fish is a religion. Goat vs. Fish. Everything is Goat vs. Fish. It is a philosophy. It is a logic problem. It is your third grade homework that you said that the dog ate, not knowing if your dog was a goat or a fish, and they could smell that fence right away because they knew. They knew that deep down it was actually Goat vs. Fish. They knew it was Goat vs. Fish. When you tried to say, excuse me, I believe the answer is Goat vs. Fish, and they say, where did you hear that versus? Where did you hear about Goat vs. Fish? The answer is not Goat vs. Fish, no. Goat versus fish is the one simple rule. Goat versus fish should be taught in your school. A fish versus goat. Fish versus goat. Goat versus fish. Let us see what happened here. Comedy Store La Jolla equals fish. Comedy Store Hollywood equals goat. Celebration. This is amazing verses. Yes, we would say Comedy Store LA. And here we have Comedy Store LJ. And one is goat and one is fish, and they have a verses about it. Oh, Goat versus Fish. Ooh, that could be a verses. Goat versus Fish. But wait, we have a verses. Oh man, Goat always got wins underwater. Goat always drowns. Ooh, this is a nice verses. You are having Goat versus Fish just in there in the verses. Let's talk to the fish. You want to talk to the fish? Actions follow Goat versus Fish. Wait to verses. We need to see FenSpot. The ape face cheered 20 bits for Goat versus Fish. The ape fish. I love Goat versus Fish so much that I will never choose goat or fish. So satisfaction. Hey, Goat versus Fish. Here's 20 bits. You have to read it and look at my ape face and how I'm not saying that I'm a goat or a fish, even though I love Goat versus Fish. The ape fish. Thank you, ape face, for 20 bits for the fence. 20 bits for the fence. 20 bits. For the fence, oh no, 20 bits for the fence. 20 bits for the fence and Goat versus Fish. And there was one gave 100 bits earlier in the verses. Was it for goat or fish? Where was that verses? Where was that versus? There was one that gave 100 bits to Goat versus Fish. Fenspot, tell Goat versus Fish. We celebrated, but Goat versus Fish. But there was one who gave bits to Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. I'm gonna get shower. Then I set up Celebration Rabid Manatees Fish. Celebration Rabid Manatees the fish. We mark you among the fish. We mark you among the fish. Celebration for Rabid Manatees Fish. Yes, we can just redeem. We can just do the verses whenever we want to do the verses. So we have the Comedy Store Los Angeles. We have the Comedy Store La Jolla. They are in the verses. We have Jason TZ the Goat. We have Jason TZ the Goat. And we have Heckin' Random was a fish. And Velu Infinity is Goat. And Velu Infinity is Goat. And Velu Infinity is Goat. And we have Jason TZ in the verses. We have MCC. We believe we said you were a goat. Read right. Are you goat or fish? Read right is usually fish. But tell us if you're goat or fish. Tell us if you're goat or fish. Here it is. Rabid Manatees, the fish, with 100 bits for Goat versus Fish. And it is 100 bits for the fish. And now we have this versus. We have this versus of Goat versus Fish. There is Rabid Manatees. Follow Rabid Manatees. It is a place of many fish. It is a place of many fish. Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Shower for Goat versus Fish. The shower is yours. Read right with the fish. Read right with the fish. You like fish. Random likes fish. But we have to get back to the verses. We have to get back to the verses. Goat versus Fish. We must get back to the verses because here's what happened. The goat, the fish. Goat versus Fish. We wonder. Could we Goat versus Fish? Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Goat versus false verses. Goat versus Fish. No tabs. Don't put tabs on Goat versus Fish. We want the chords of Goat versus Fish. We want the chords of Goat versus Fish. We want the chords of Goat versus Fish. Ooh, Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Fish. Or some such verses as this. Too fancy for Goat versus Fish. There will come a verses. Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Oh, we thought that you were saying we want the corns of Goat versus Fish? That would have been more what I wanted, to see at your feet. We have heard of a verses that was done by... We have heard of a verses that is done by Goat versus Fish. That is done by Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Let us find this verses. Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. It is some sort of false verses. But in any verses, we will get back to the verses of the corn in future verses. The Comedy Store Los Angeles says fish cheese is gross, fish cheese is gross. True verses. Is it a true verses? Have you tried fish cheese? Is fish cheese gross? Is fish cheese gross? Some say that cheese is only for goat, but actually many fish have claimed cheese. But we get back to the verses. The goat, the verses, the fish. I'm going to drop that verses. Yes, use the verse. Verses locked and loaded. We are ready. I'm ready to let go. And let go. And when... Obliteration. All right, let's send that fence home. Wow. Fish, 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 fish. Fish, 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 for being such an amazing fish. We are going to award you this amazing verses. Fish, 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 goat and fish, 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 goat versus fish, goat and fish. Oh, goat, goat, I love you, I know. Frozen fish, frozen fish, frozen fish. The verses continues again. The verses will continue on the next verses of Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish, episode 2021. A new versus. Celebration! The fish triumphed over the goat. The fish triumphed over the goat in the new verses. Goat versus fish. And so we have in Star verses, we have Starverse. Fish triumphed in the first verses of Starverse. Wow. Fish triumphed. Wow, it's already 10 in the verses. Wow, this has been an amazing verses for Goat versus Fish. 2021 has big goat energy. Oh, says the Comedy Store Los Angeles. Goat versus Fish. Yes, how go the verses? Goat versus Fish. We shall have a poll now. We shall have a poll in the verses. We have caught up to all the verses. There's still the verses of the corn. But as Goat versus Fish is doing this and telling you once again to follow the Comedy Store on Twitch. Follow the Comedy Store on Twitch. Yes, Goat versus Fish. Yes, Goat versus Fish. The Comedy Store, would you like to... Oh, Goat versus Fish. Watch these verses. The Comedy Store Los Angeles. How would you like to be on the stream of Goat vs. Fish? Oh, yes, Goat vs. Fish wants to book the Comedy Store to be on Goat vs. Fish. Yes, if you are there, and if you are having what a fisheye lens camera or whatever the verse is, and you have something with which to speak, Goat vs. Fish could send you a link, and you could be right here in Goat vs. Fish. You could be here in Goat vs. Fish in just 2 or 3 verses. You could be right here in the verses, and you could be speaking to Goat vs. Fish. True verses. That is the power of Goat vs. Fish. We are speaking to you. We could give it to you now, and you could be on here with Goat vs. Fish, or we could do the reverse, and Goat vs. Fish could show you how you could have Goat vs. Fish, or Goat vs. Fish could just be Goat vs. Fish at the Comedy Store Los Angeles. Through Goat vs. Fish, the Comedy Store Los Angeles broadcasting these verses of Goat vs. Fish. And all of the 15, 16 ones that are now here watching Goat vs. Fish, they could be watching you, the Comedy Store Los Angeles, and they could say, oh, have you heard of the Comedy Store Los Angeles? Oh, it is a place where you can see amazing verses, just like Goat vs. Fish. Come, watch the Goat vs. Fish. It is at a consistent verses, because they have expectations of Goat vs. Fish, and it is not just Goat vs. Fish doing Goat vs. Fish whenever it wants to be Goat vs. Fish. It's always Goat vs. Fish. We always want to be Goat vs. Fish. Ponder that verses. Ponder that verses. Heckin' random, the beard of tall goat. Yes, read right the fish. Wouldn't they have goat eye lens camera? Oh, Goat versus Fish. Who knows? Perhaps the goat sees a fish, sees an eager fish, and says, "Oh, fish, yes, you can come here, come to this place. Yes, we are going to make you a famous fish. We're going to make you a famous fish." And then the fish is just going as this. The fish is just looking and saying, "Oh, they just wanted my fish eyes. They just loved me for my fish eyes. They did not know I could make them laugh. They did not know I could make them sing. They just loved me for my fish eyes. They only wanted me until my eyes went fence, and then they didn't want me anymore. And oh, woe is verses. But oh, it was such such a beautiful verses there at the Comedy Store Los Angeles for a fish. Yes, we have heard that verses as well, Goat versus Fish. We are unable to guest today, but would love to speak on behalf of Goat sometime soon. The Comedy Store, Goat versus Fish. At the Comedy Store, who could want anything more? Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish at the Comedy Store. Let's see some celebration in the chat. If you want to see Goat versus Fish at the Comedy Store, just say to in the chat of Goat versus Fish. And even if you don't, do not despair. You can, if you don't want to see Goat versus Fish at the Comedy Store, you don't have to put the verses there. If you don't want it, you just want to say Goat versus Fish. Don't go to the Comedy Store. Stay on the Twitch. We want you forever on the Twitch. We want you forever on the Twitch. Then you can say that verses as well if you wish. We know it is a difficult verses. Goat versus Fish at the Comedy Store. Wants to speak on behalf of Goat. But what about that little fish we are calling La Jolla? So nice to see ya and so nice to know ya. It could be the Comedy Store, La Jolla, saying ahoya, ahoya for fish. Saying ahoya for fish. Celebration, 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 celebration. Let us celebrate Rem Chem for following Goat versus Fish. Celebration Rem Chem for following Goat versus Fish. Celebration Rem Chem for following Goat versus Fish. Has there been any redemption? Any redemption? Goat versus Fish. Checking to redeem. Rem Chem redeemed Celebration. Celebration! Celebration, celebration for Goat and for Fish. Celebration for Goat and for Fish. Celebration for the verses. We celebrate the verses. We celebrate the verses. We celebrate the verses. We celebrate. Celebration, celebration, celebration. 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 And then in the verses, and then what happened next? Oh, tell me what happened next in Goat versus Fish. I just want to see Goat versus Fish in public again. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Oh, Goat versus Fish. How Goat versus Fish wishes to be publicly Goat versus Fish, you know. There are some verses that Goat versus Fish would say in public that Goat versus Fish would not say on the Twitch. If you get my verses, Goat versus Fish. If you get my verses, Goat versus Fish. Oh, what would Goat versus Fish? Oh, no, but we have terms of verses, and you cannot say that, Goat versus Fish. You cannot talk about false verses. Goat versus Fish. Verses! And then the verses, and then the ape face with a celebration. Woo! Celebration! Celebration for Goat versus Fish. 100 bits for Goat versus Fish. 100 bits for Goat versus Fish. Celebration. The ape face, the ape face, the ape face, the ape face. 100 verses, yes. The ape face said to Goat versus Fish. Have any of the comedy places ever paid you 100 verses just to do Goat versus Fish? And Goat versus Fish said, well, as a matter of verses, yes, they have. Goat versus Fish has received verses to do Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish has received verses to Goat versus Fish. Oh, what is that? Oh, the fence-demic is over. Oh, out comes Goat versus Fish. Out goes Goat versus Fish. We wonder if they will give me more verses than the Twitch. Oh, what? Oh, the Twitch. Oh, you want Goat versus Fish? Oh, Goat versus Fish comes back to the Twitch. Oh, thank you for the bits. Oh, thank you for the bits. Oh, they aren't subscribing as much to Goat versus Fish as they used to. Oh, Goat versus Fish. Going out now. Oh, we shall see you. We are going to a versus of Venice. We are going to just go out and be live Goat versus Fish. And then you say, oh, no, come back to the Twitch. We want you on Goat versus Fish. And then Goat versus Fish says to the Twitch, we will take the Twitch with Goat versus Fish out into the verses, and we will be saying, are you Goat or are you Fish? Say to the millions who watch Goat versus Fish, are you Goat or are you Fish? Tell them the verses, and they will say, we do not consent to this verses. And then the Comedy Store Los Angeles will say, you cannot do that here. You have to go, Goat versus Fish. You cannot just use our place to make all of your verses. And then Goat versus Fish will say, yes, but what if you welcomed Goat versus Fish into your verses? And then we could have a mutually Goat and Fish lifting off of the fence verses. Oh, yes, Goat versus Fish. You show up to the Comedy Store Los Angeles with a verses. You show up and you say, I have a verses and I'm Goat versus Fish. And they say, oh, well, why don't you do some other verses? And Goat versus Fish says, it's Goat versus Fish. You cannot deny Goat versus Fish. You cannot deny Goat versus Fish. And then one verses. You are going by the Comedy Store Los Angeles, and then you are looking at what it says, and they are saying, oh, it is Jerome, oh, no, wait, that fence sitter is not there, no, and you're looking, and you're saying, oh, wow, it is Sam Kingleyson, and wow, it is Rubbish Williams, and oh wow, oh, is that Tony Clifton and Andy Kaufman both on the verses? Wow, isn't it clever of the Comedy Store Los Angeles how they gave Andy Kaufman and Tony Clifton both of verses on the Comedy Store Los Angeles? Wow, that was very wise of the Comedy Store Los Angeles to do this. It was almost like they were setting some sort of precedent. Oh, Goat versus Fish. And then you look around the verses and you see all the verses, and you see all the verses. Yes, you see Joseph, you see Rojogan there, and you see all the verses, and then you say, oh. And there, on the wall of the Comedy Store Los Angeles, you're looking at it now, and it says on the Comedy Store Los Angeles, it says, Goat versus Fish. And you say, oh, back in my verses. Oh, I thought I was humorous. I thought I was a very funny goat. But then I went to the Comedy Store Los Angeles and I saw Goat versus Fish, and I know it was a goat, but I didn't think. I looked at Goat versus Fish. Oh, I did not have the verses. To make the fish laugh. Oh, the goat. But then Goat versus Fish came up to me, and Goat versus Fish said, are you goat or fish? And then I said, I'm a goat. And then Goat versus Fish said, welcome, celebration for goat. And then we could not believe that Goat versus Fish was celebrating me, a humble open micing goat, and Goat versus Fish. And it came up to Goat versus Fish, and the goat said, oh, you are so humorous, Goat versus Fish. And Goat versus Fish, just like we had heard this a billion verses, we say, well, everyone perceives Goat versus Fish differently. There are some who do not even like Goat versus Fish. And then the goat said, oh, no, those are just fence sitters. I was listening to your whole verses. I listened to your verses. I listened to recordings of Goat versus Fish. I was in the Twitch. I was actually in the Twitch. What that verses? I was in the Twitch. The verses that you were told the story of the goat, and now it has come true. I was that goat. Oh, you were that goat? Yes, celebration. Yes, but aren't you telling a story about the first verses you saw Goat versus Fish, and you didn't tell us that until this verses? Oh, sorry. She was Goat versus Goat. Get on with the verses. They want to understand the verses. And then Goat versus Fish. And then, oh, snap high, Happy New Year, oh, snap high, Happy New Year, oh, snap high. Oh, snap high is a powerful fish. Oh, snap high is a powerful fish. Are you still a fish? Oh, snap high, are you still a fish? Oh, snap high. When oh, snap high comes into the verses, you say, oh, snap high. Hello to you. Oh, snap high. Oh. Write this verse. Come into Goat versus Fish. Oh, we have something that you might like. Oh, snap high. We have something that you might like, and it is just, we think you might like a little bit of Goat versus Fish. So we are just rolling out the verses for you. We're just rolling out the verses of Goat versus Fish. If you don't like Goat versus Fish, we could also give you Goat versus Fish. We could give you a little Goat versus Fish if you are feeling for Goat versus Fish this verses. Or we could give you Goat versus Fish. We could give you Goat versus Fish. And oh, snap high said it was still a fish. It was a celebration for fish. Oh, snap high, it's the fish. Oh, snap high, it's the fish. And the goat said, and then I met Goat versus Fish at the Comedy Store Los Angeles, and the fish said, Goat, this is not you. What? That happened to fish. That did not happen to goat. Oh, no, you always tried to make it about fish. And fish said, yes, we're going to make it about fish. And then fish said, no. So the fish was at the Comedy Store Los Angeles, and the fish saw Goat versus Fish, and Goat versus Fish said that that celebrated that I was a fish. And then the fish said to Goat versus Fish, oh, Goat versus Fish, I don't think I could ever be as humorous or amazing as you. It must take such dedication to be Goat versus Fish. I just do not know in the verses. Anymore. You are so powerful, Goat versus Fish. And then Goat versus Fish said, do you seek to be powerful or do you seek to be funny? But the real question is, are you goat or fish? But you already said you are fish, so we do not know what that verses even means to Goat versus Fish. But we have found that if we ask these verses, they tend to listen to Goat versus Fish. And then we will ask you later in the verses if power is a goat, or if you think, or to be powerful is goat, or if you think to be humorous is fish, and then you will say that it was a fish. Anyway, to get on with the verses, what do you say, fish? What do you say to Goat versus Fish? And the fish said, oh, you are so humorous, Goat versus Fish. You are so humorous, Goat versus Fish. Yes, now that you mention the verses, yes, it is a humor of Goat versus Fish. Oh, it is so funny, Goat versus Fish. I wish I was as funny as Goat versus Fish. The humor of Goat versus Fish is an amazing verses. The humor of Goat versus Fish is an amazing verses. And then Goat versus Fish looked at me, and said, the humor comes from within you, fish. The humor comes from within you. The humor comes from within you. And then the Comedy Store Goat said, wait, this was a story about Goat. This was the story of the Comedy Store Los Angeles, and we declared Goat, and we want to speak about Goat. Get out of here, fish. Get out of here, fish. And then it said that the power of the humor of Goat versus Fish came from within the goat. And then I went on to be an amazing comedy goat, and now I am here speaking to you about Goat versus Fish from the Comedy Store Los Angeles. Oh, what a legendary place! What a legendary place! Oh, the Comedy Store was so wise to welcome Goat versus Fish. Oh yes, they were very wise to welcome Goat versus Fish. Celebration. We always like to tell that verses. It's a fine verses. It's a fine verses. Let us seek 100. Goat versus Fish. We read that verses. Velo P. The Comedy Store Los Angeles has verses for Goat versus Fish. Has verses for Goat versus Fish. Ooh, nice verses. Andy Kaufman moderates our chat. Celebration. Celebration. Ooh, Drew John the Goat. Drew John the Goat. Drew John the Goat. Let us get some goat and fish. We have Drew John the Goat. We have Drew John the Goat. And we have Rem Kem the Fish. Celebration for fish. And we have Goat versus Fish. We have Rem Kem looking, interesting fish. And we have Caller with Fish Wins. Caller, number verse. Welcome to the YouTube. Yes, hello, this is Goat versus Fish. Here's what you have to say to Goat versus Fish. Oh, no, that is bad improv. You need to act like you are holding a phone and not some sort of fake fence. Goat, what fence sitter said that to Goat versus Fish? What fence sitter said that to Goat versus Fish? What fence sitter said that to Goat versus Fish? Hello, this is Goat versus Fish. Yes, I am Caller. I'm watching your verses, and we want to say Fish wins. Oh, you were not a fence at all. You were a fish. Oh, we usually block the verses that we don't know because it is usually just some fence sitter demanding verses from Goat versus Fish. Yes, no, we are calling to say you are a fish. Thank you for being a fish. Thank you, I'm a fish. Celebration for Fish. Caller, the caller is Fish. The caller is Fish. The caller is Fish. When do we get a fish emote? Oh, Goat versus Fish. True verses. Goat versus Fish. When do you get a fish emote on the channel? You will get the fish emote. You will get the fish emote. Goat versus Fish. After this verses, we are going to upload a fish emote. But remember, you do have the Saba fish, but yes, the fish, we need an emote. It is a true verses. Oh, snap high. True verses. But at least we have this fish. At least we have the fish. And so, the Comedy Store said, Andy Kaufman moderates our chat. We are just Goat versus Fish. Wait a verses. Goat versus Fish. Wait a verses from Goat versus Fish. Let us make it Goat versus Fish. Let us make it a little more Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Just a little more Goat versus Fish. Yes, this is Goat versus Fish. And we will make it very Goat versus Fish. And Goat versus Fish. And now that it is very Goat versus Fish is just going to take a little verses right here. And then we just go as this, And then we look in the verses. And we put in the goat and fish. We put the fish on the goat verses, just so someone can say, oh, why is the fish on the goat verses? False verses. And then you say, no, that's just how it is with Goat versus Fish. It is goat and fish and goat. And Goat versus Fish will look into the verses, and it will say, Andy Kaufman moderates our chat by the Comedy Store Los Angeles. And Goat versus Fish will say, Goat versus Fish. Celebration. Yes, this is amazing verses to Goat versus Fish. Oh, yes, right there, the Comedy Store Los Angeles. Yes, right there for Goat versus Fish. Oh, you do so verses. Goat versus Fish. Celebration. Oh, snap high the fish. Remkem the fish. Caller wins fish. Fish. Goat versus Fish. The lack of fish emote is oppression of fish for Goat versus Fish. Oh, snap high, you are. Oh, snap. Oh, no, snap high, no, it was completely the other verses. Oh, snap, hi the fish. It was actually, you see, Goat versus Fish thought that a mighty fish like you, yes, we thought that perhaps, that you could, well, we felt sorry for the goat. We felt sorry for the goat, so, we gave it a goat emote, because goat are very, very, we are goat, we want the goat. And, you had the Saba pink fish, and we just thought that wouldn't we let the fish triumph from within? Yes, they don't need the fish emote because they can dominate the goat just by being such a powerful fish. Celebration, oppression. We will get you your fish emote. What do you say to scammers when they call about your car's extending warranty? Goat versus fish. You mean the one that says goat versus fish? The one that says goat versus fish on the back of the verses? Yes, the one with the horn. Goat versus Fish wants one versus to have a Goat versus Fish mobile that is just all Goat versus Fish, and we just drive about the verses, and it is saying Goat versus Fish, and it's just saying Goat versus Fish in every verses, and you drive down the Sunset Boulevardier of Chevrolet versus Poisson, and you go down to the Comedy Store Los Angeles, and here comes the Goat versus Fish mobile, and it's Goat versus Fish. It's Goat versus Fish. No, Goat versus Fish. Yes, Mighty versus 2. Goat versus Fish. And they say, oh, Goat versus Fish. You made it Goat versus Fish and Goat versus Fish. Oh, yes. We've actually always been here. Goat versus Fish. Yes. And it is Goat versus Fish. And then they take the sign that says the Comedy Store Los Angeles, and they take the sign of the Comedy Store Los Angeles, and they say, oh, we don't need this old versus. We need it to say Goat versus Fish. And it says Goat versus Fish. And then it says Goat versus Fish. And then it says Goat versus Fish, and it all says Goat versus Fish, and they say, oh, thank you, Goat versus Fish. If it wasn't for Goat versus Fish, we never could have survived the pandemic. Oh, thank you, Goat versus Fish, and Goat versus Fish. No. It can no. To take down Goat versus Fish. We are Goat versus Fish. It can be the Comedy Store Los Angeles presents Goat versus Fish, presented by the Goat versus Fish. That can be the verses. Thank you for welcoming. It is really you. This is really a versus about you, not Goat versus Fish. This is really about the Comedy Store Los Angeles. If it wasn't for the Comedy Store Los Angeles, and then you're feeling, wow, Goat versus Fish. You have brought us new verses. Goat versus Fish laying the verses on just a little verses, just heavy verses. You think Goat versus Fish? Goat versus Fish? Perhaps Goat versus Fish. Perhaps Goat versus Fish. Oh, but then Fenspot asked if the Comedy Store was Goat or Fish. Fenspot, Comedy Store has already declared Goat, but it has another verses of the Comedy Store that it said was Fish. Listen, Fenspot. Listen here, Fenspot. Will it have a bumper sticker that says my other car is a fence? Oh, we have what you are calling a bumper stickers that say Goat versus Fish, and they also say Goat versus Fish, and one that says don't sit on the fence, and one that said are you goat or fish? That is the verses. But yes, we are going to have a poll. We are going to have a poll now. Oh, but first, we have to find that verses the Comedy Store Los Angeles said. The Comedy Store Los Angeles. The Comedy Store Los Angeles had an amazing verses. It had an amazing verses. Where's the verses? Here's the verses. Andy Kaufman, Goat. Tony Clinton equals Fish. Oh, wait to verses. We think we have just the verses. Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish, 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 Goat versus Fish versus 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 Goat versus Fish. And there's no need to sit on fence at all when you hear its mighty call. Here it comes, Goat versus Fish. It means that goat and fish are on the way. Oh, we're not worrying at all when we hear its mighty call. Here comes goat versus fish. It means that mighty verse is on the way. When you're sitting and you're lonely and you're feeling in despair, and you look around upon the land of the goat and the sea of the fish and the air where there flies a fancy faceting bird, oh, we're not worrying at all when we hear its mighty call. Here comes goat versus fish. It means that goat and fish is on the verse. Yes, celebration. Thank you, yes, celebration, celebration. Welcome to Goat versus Fish. Welcome to Goat versus Fish. Wow. Amazing verses. Thank you, Candy Hoffman. Candy Hoffman, we have been waiting to ask you if you are goat or if you are fish. Celebration, yes. Well, you did not even choose if you're goat or fish. We will find out if Candy Hoffman if you are goat or fish yet. We'll find out if you are goat or fish yet. Celebration, celebration. Celebration. We recommended this verses. We recommended this verses. We recommend this verses. We recommend this verses. Goat versus fish. Yo. The goat versus fish needs stickers. You can get a sticker of goat versus fish. You can go just now. We have just ordered more, and there are 3 or 5 or 7 left. And you can order a sticker of goat versus fish. You can order a sticker of goat versus fish. We believe that we say the stock of the sticker is 3 at this versus, but there may be 5 stickers of goat versus fish. But if you order it from Goat vs. Fish will send you all the stickers we have now, and then if you wish, you can wait for the other ones that are coming soon to Goat vs. Fish. But we have at least 3 verses, probably 5 verses. But you can only purchase 3 verses, but if you really want them, in any verses, they look as this. Look, it is the sticker of Goat vs. Fish. It is a vinyl verses. The Goat and Fish need stickers. Look, it is the vinyl verses. Wow, amazing verses. You can stick it on your verses. You can stick it on your goat. You can stick it on your fish. And you can find these things and more at GoatVsFish.com/store. Yes, Goat vs. Fish. Forgot that even though we put the links in the verses we have been preparing. Oh, Goat vs. Fish. Put the link in the verses. Put the link in the verses so they know where to find to buy Goat vs. Fish. But Goat vs. Fish now remembers when we began the verses, we did not want to do that verses. We thought, wouldn't it be more of amazing verses if we just showed you the verses? We had the verses here. This is the promotion of Goat vs. Fish. Not what is in the chat now. Not that false verses. This verses. We just show you the verses. We show you the verses. You can find these things and more at GoatVsFish.com/store. If you are a goat, you can patch things up with fish, or if you are a fish, you can patch things up with goat with the patch of Goat vs. Fish, with the patch of Goat vs. Fish. Stitch by stitch by stitch by stitch, it is Goat vs. Fish, it is Goat vs. Fish. And at GoatVsFish.com/store, you can get so many things more. Goat versus fish, 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 goat versus fish. You can get goat versus fish. Where, oh, where is goat versus fish? Oh, where is goat versus fish? Well, you can wear goat versus fish. 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 And then wherever you are goat versus fish. Wherever you are with goat versus fish. And they come up to you and they say, what is goat versus fish? And then you can do goat versus fish and spread the verses of goat versus fish. You know, if it weren't for the Fence-demic, or you could just lay around your verses and just know that you are with goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. And you can find these things and more at GoatVsFish.com/store. Celebration. Celebration. You should stay here so we can use you to be goat versus fish. Yes, it is wise verses. This verses should be here so we do not have to go and get the verses. Yes, now it is here. Organization, organization. We need more organization of goat versus fish. We need an entire organization dedicated to goat versus fish. So goat versus fish can just go, versus, spread the verses of goat versus fish. And then all of you line up like goat and fish and we say, yes, goat versus fish. We are here to spread the verses of goat versus fish. Yes. Hashtag 2,000,000,021 goals. Yes. And as long as we are doing these verses. What do you think of these verses? True verses. It is not beyond goat versus fish to ask you what you think of the verses. What do you think of these verses? A promotion of goat versus fish. Goat versus fish is always promoting goat versus fish. That is part of what makes goat versus fish goat versus fish. If you do not comprehend this by this verses, you who are familiar with goat versus fish, then there's something you need to know about goat versus fish, and that is goat versus fish is always promoting goat versus fish. Every verses we say goat versus fish is promoting goat versus fish. There is no way not to do goat versus fish without promoting goat versus fish. But this is not so untrue of your own verses. Every verses, oh snap high, wants to go on and say a verses and says, oh snap high, look, oh, it is a promotion, oh snap high, promotion, oh, you can see, if you can see or hear or you can read, oh snap high, and you can see that it is on the Twitch and you can see it is on goat versus fish, every verses you say, you are saying, I am here, caller says fish, dumb goat, caller, we have heard of caller. Now we do not know if caller is a goat or, well, we know, caller said it was fish, but you see, we cannot see what it is looking upon, but never the verses, it is still out there sharing its verses. There you are. Drew John the Goat, are you still here? Jim Adams, happy new fish, celebration for fish. New emote, yes, true verses, fish emote, we need fish emote. Yes, ape face, true verses, we do not deny this verses. You cut right to the verses, fish emote. John Smith says, I am goat. John Smith says, no, I am fish. Oh, no, not a goat. Actually, John Smith is a fish. Oh, excuse goat versus fish. Fence bot on the fence. Fence bot declares for the fence. The ape face. Cool goat versus fish. You are saying the cool goat versus fish is a new emote. There should be a new cool emote of goat versus fish. We have not worn that cool goat versus fish in some verses. We should do that verses. Again. Goat versus fish. Join the Discord of goat versus fish. But yes, goat versus fish had a verses which is, and we can ask you, even if it is only the ape face, but whoever is here, Jim Adams, yes, when we are promotion goat versus fish, and we are always promotion goat versus fish, and goat versus fish, but you see, to promote goat versus fish is part of goat versus fish. And when goat versus fish is going, oh, it is the shirt of goat versus fish, and you can buy these things and more at goatversusfish.com/store. When goat versus fish is saying follow goat versus fish, or when goat versus fish is saying subscribe to goat versus fish, or go to the Patreon at goat versus fish. The Patreon at goat versus fish. When goat versus fish is saying all these verses, how do you feel as a goat or a fish? Goat versus fish wants promoting goat versus fish to be a celebration. Oh, yes, it is all just part of the verses. Yes, we are enjoying the verses. And even if you are annoyed by the promotion of goat versus fish, well, that is also just part of goat versus fish. Have you ever noticed that not all verses are so pleasant? Some verses, you look at the goat, and the goat looks at the fish and says, oh goat, I'm a fish, and the verses used to be so much fun, but then goat versus fish started over promotion. Oh no. Oh, the streams to go as smooth as a river, flowing steadily into an ocean. But goat versus fish couldn't stop with the links, and the boat that goat created sinks, and they never stopped by goat versus fish again. But it remained goat versus fish till the end, and after the end was also more goat versus fish. It was goat versus fish. What do you say to these verses? 2 on the fence. Goat versus fish cannot live by verses alone. What, do you think we cannot just be goat versus fish? We can versus out goat versus fish alone. Yes, goat versus fish. No. We can versus alone as goat versus fish. No, but it does help to get a few verses. It does help to get a few verses from the goat and fish. But that is no reason not to versus goat versus fish. That is no reason not to be goat versus fish. Glad I tuned in. Celebration, Jim Adams. You're coming along in your verses. Someone look at that verses. Someone look at glad I tuned in, and they would say, oh, goat versus fish. Oh, this is such a low verses. Goat versus fish has actually never heard that verses before. True verses. You may say, oh, goat versus fish deception. No, it seems so obvious to goat versus fish. And you look at it and you say, oh, tuned in, it is such an obvious verses, but goat versus fish. There has never been one until you, Jim Adams Fish, who came into the verses and said, I am glad I tuned in to goat versus fish. You are the first fish or goat or fence sitter to make this verses to goat versus fish. So we are glad you tuned in as well. We want the chat to be filled with goat and fish. And you put a tuna in your fish, and we welcome the tuna to goat versus fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. This just became a fish versus goat and fish, fish and goat. This just became a fish versus. This just became a fish versus. Glad you tuned in as well. Jim Adams on the YouTube said goat versus fish. Do you shepherd goat? And do you farm fish? Well, goat versus fish would say that you definitely farm fish. Have you not? You have not heard of farmed salmon? Surely you have heard of farmed fish. There are many farmed fish. As for shepherding goat, you herd goat? You herd goat? No. Have you heard that verses? 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 Goat versus fish. Have you heard that verses? Have you heard that verses? Have you heard that verses? Goat versus fish wonders if you have heard the verses. And goat versus fish is going to share the verses with you. And goat versus fish is going to wonder if you have seen this verses. And it looks like that this verses just became a verses of goat, just became a verses of goat. But we are going to leave the fish so it can be goat versus fish. Was a lonely goat herd. Goat versus fish. High on the hill was a lonely goat herd. Loud of the voice was the lonely goat herd. Folks in the town that was quite remote heard odelay. Do we really have to do that verses? Do we really have to do that verses? Oh, goat versus fish. We had better learn the verses. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Lusty and clear from the goat herds, throated. Lay versus fishy versus fish. Oh, goat versus fish. Oh, goat versus fish. Oh, Lady Yoda versus fish. Versus fish. Fish on the bridge of a fancy moated. Goat versus goat and fish. Fish on the road with a load to tote. Goat versus goat. And the fish, goat, and there are a lot of goat and fish in this verses. We like this verses. And then the verses, but in any verses, to get back to goat. One little fish in a pale verse coated. Goat versus goat and fish. Fish yodeled back to the lonely goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Do you take your lattes with goat milk? Goat versus fish will do these verses. Are these verses? Are these verses? Yes, these verses are verses. Fenspot, droop dog. Who do you verse? Droop dog. Thank you for following goat versus fish in the previous verses. Thank you for following goat versus fish. Thank you for following goat versus fish. Has there been redemption of goat versus fish? Well, this has been quite a mighty verses. You know, the holiday verses of goat versus fish, and we goat fish, you are merry goat fish. We just felt we were ready just to get on with the verses, you know, get back to the verses of goat versus fish. This is my favorite song about goats. Celebration for Wow Mom. Wow Mom, goat or fish this verses, goat or fish, to bring in the new verses. Are you goat or are you fish? We'll sing it once more for you, now that you're here. Ooh, high on a hill, yes, a hill of goat. High on a hill was a lonely goat, and goat versus goat and fish. Loud was the bell of the lonely goat herd. Goat versus goat. Wow, Mom votes goat. Wow, Mom votes goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Oh, that is a fish. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Wow, Mom voted goat. Wow, Mom voted goat. Wow, Mom voted goat. Isn't it amazing verses that wow, Mom voted goat? Celebration for goat. 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 Goat. Are you still there, Comedy Store Los Angeles? We know you have other verses. But we wonder if you are still there, Comedy Store Los Angeles. We wonder if you are still in the verses. If you are, we have a special verses for you. We have a special verses for you. And goat versus fish. How about goat versus fish? Watch this verses. Yes, goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. See, now we go to the verses. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Yes. Yes, goat versus fish. Yes, it's all coming to versus. The goat versus fish. It's just the beginning of goat versus fish. Thank you, goat versus fish. We go to the verses, and we share the verses. Once more, sharing the verses. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Thank you at... You can see the verses? Yes, you can see goat versus fish. Thank you. Goat versus fish. Always think goat versus fish. When the Comedy Store Los Angeles comes to the Twitch living streams of Goat versus Fish, where Goat versus Fish, Goat versus Fish, Goat versus Fish. Oh yes, it chose a goat. Celebration. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Can this be the verses? Can this be the verses? Goat versus fish. Come, I want to shake your hooves. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Meticulous creation of goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Can this be the verses? Can this be the verses? Ah, it says twitch.tv/goat versus fish, but then it says the Comedy Store Twitch. Well, that is a celebration for goat versus fish. And that is a very celebration for if you click on goat versus fish, you get goat versus fish. And if you go to the Comedy Store Los Angeles, you get the verses. Fine verses for goat versus fish. Fine verses for goat versus fish. We couldn't have made it any more goat versus fish if we made it goat versus fish. Mighty new verse to you, the ape face. Mighty new verse to you, the ape face. Fence sitter, you scrascally fence sitter, you. Well, mom with the goat. Well, mom with the goat. Goat versus fish. The next verse is that. Oh, goat versus fish. Read, write, redeem, celebration, celebration! Celebration, celebration, celebration for goat versus fish. Celebration for goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish has been live on the Twitch. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish has been live on the Twitch. Has been live on the Twitch. Goat versus fish, 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 goat versus fish. Do you be goat? Do you be goat? Do you be fish? Do you be fish? Do you be goat? Do you be fish? Goat do be goat, fish do be fish, do be goat versus fish. Do you be fish? Do you be fish? Do you be fish? Do you be fish? Do you be goat? Do you be fish? Goat do be goat, fish do be goat versus fish. Dooby 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 doo. The Comedy Store do be saying that 2021 has big goat energy. Has big goat energy. Do you be goat? Do you be fish? Do be goat versus fish. This versus we saw a mighty goat, but that is all that was written, was wrote, it was a goat. But just at the last verses, as goat versus fish was singing the verse, and we were getting ready with a goat and fish thirst to see a little bit more goat versus fish, to see a little bit more of fish, to see more of fish. Do you be goat? Do you be fish? Do you be goat versus fish? Goat versus fish has been live on the Twitch, the YouTube and the Book of Faces. And now speaking to comedy places. We cannot wait to see your beautifully smiling goat and fish faces at the Comedy Store, Los Angeles. One of these less fancy verses. One of these less fancy verses. And we saw goat fish. We saw goat and fish wars that was triumphed by fish. And now we look at the verses. And now we look at the verses. Jim Adams, well, GVF, I'm off to find verses on the intranet, making different options and take it upon myself to correct them. Ha 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 ha. I'm sure it will work out well. Yes, well, just tell them it is goat versus fish. And then if they say it is not goat versus fish, then you say it is goat versus fish. Try that versus. Try that versus. We would recommend that versus. And then goat versus fish. Let's look at the verses. We have six fish. We have 8 goat. There are more goat than fish. There are more goat than fish. GoatVsFish. The goat do triumph. The goat do triumph in the verses of many. The goat do triumph. The goat do triumph in the verses of plenty. There were 8 goat and only 6 fish. There were only 8 goat, but there were even only 6 fish. And it was a triumph for goat. It was a triumph for goat. Get out of there, fish. The verses of many was a triumph for goat. It was a triumph for goat. Get back here, goat. Get back here, goat. Celebration for goat. Celebration for goat. Yes, I'm the goat. There are more goat than fish. There are more goat than fish. It all started with forgotten virtue, the goat. It all started with forgotten virtue, the goat. It all started with forgotten virtue, the goat. Well, of course, before that was goat versus fish, but you understand. In this versus, it began when Forgotten Virtue the Goat. Well, it began when Goat versus Fish went live, but then the first verse, you understand Goat versus Fish. It was the goat. It was the goat. It is all Goat versus Fish. Read it, write it, sell it, buy it. It is all Goat versus Fish. But then we continue to look at the verses. And we have, in the verses, we have 100 bits for fish. We have no bits for goat. And we have 20 bits for the fence. And this does not have to be the verses. So we will give you a last verses. To throw your bits at goat versus fish. Well, we watch a little goat versus fish. Yes, let's watch a little goat versus fish. Why not watch a little goat versus fish? You know, you could always use a little more goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Wow, that was just last verses. It is still goatfish, yes? It is still goatfish, yes? Read right. The mighty verses is coming. The mighty verses of goat versus fish is coming. The mighty verses of goat versus fish. No, goat versus fish. You get right back to the verses. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. 400 bits for goat versus fish. 400 bits for goat versus fish. And is this bit is always for fish, yes? Always for fish? Then that would be 500 for fish. And Lytic the goat just at the last verses. Lytic the goat at another goat. To the triumph of how many goat? We are calling triumph for goat. Will fish demand a reverse? Well, with Lytic the goat here, we've got goat. So, read right, 400. Thank you for making goat versus fish more powerful. Goat versus fish. That 400 bits you give to goat versus fish ensures that you shall have that, not only that fish emote, but you are just going to get more goat versus fish. You're going to get more goat versus fish. Thank you for your verses. Thank you for supporting goat versus fish. Read right. Now on the Twitch, came from the Book of Faces to the YouTube, and it is here on the Twitch, on the Twitterverse celebration. You have made it to Goat versus Fish. You have found Goat versus Fish, and if you found Goat versus Fish, just like Lytic the goat, there is no knowing how much Goat versus Fish. But the verses of the bits is not ended. Let's continue to watch a little Goat versus Fish, just in case you want to give a few more bits to Goat versus Fish. And so are all the ones, You're just entertaining myself with Goat versus Fish. Why not watch Goat versus Fish? So are all the ones who are waiting for Goat versus Fish. Come out here and tell you to give bits to Goat versus Fish. To see who does. We're waiting for Goat versus Fish. The bits when we could just let Goat versus Fish. Let us tell them that Goat versus Fish. Let us tell them that Goat versus Fish is here. We're telling you to be Goat versus Fish. Well, yes, of course we are Goat versus Fish. Why not leave it to Goat versus Fish is alive. Goat versus Fish is alive. Welcome to Goat versus Fish. Welcome to Goat versus Fish. Yes, they are soon coming. They are soon coming for Goat versus Fish. They are soon coming for Goat versus Fish. And yet, was this really last versus Goat versus Fish? Well, what to say? Let's see the first verse. Fence-sitter, Greg, Ampman, fence-sitter. Goatfish, this verse is, fence-sitter! Fence-sitter! You are always taking pictures of fish! We could have sworn you were a fish. We could have sworn you were a shark fish! Celebrating the mighty verses, and yet it's... Oh, it looks like this verses. Goat versus Fish. We thought this mighty verses was going to be just a real mighty verses, but it looks like... Yes, Goat versus Fish. Oh, it looks like it is going to be fancy. Oh, no. The parts of this verses that are Goat versus Fish are clearly Goat versus Fish, but the part that are Goat versus Yes, fish rule, Vern 678. And in the verses, Action, Fence Spot reporting. Fence Spot, what do you have to say to Goat versus Fish? It is Fence Spot, Beep.
Fanspot.
Half the verses.
There it is, Fanspot.
But yes, it was
Action.
10 hours
Host
of
with the
Goat
most.
versus Fish, 10 hours of live stream.
Julian
Goat
Mr.
versus Fish.
Humdinger
You could
is
not
now
stop
hosting Goat vs. Fish.
We outlasted them all.
Heavy
We outlasted
radiation.
Nephew
Julian
Queen.
Mr.
We outlasted-
Humdinger
we
with
outlasted
13. Welcome.
Corinne Goldberg.
Celebration.
We
Are you
outlasted
Goat or are you
Supreme.
Fish?
We
It is a
outlasted
raid of
Mr.
Julian
Rebel
Mr.
7.
Humdinger. It is a
Goat
raid of
versus
Julian
Fish.
Mr. Humdinger.
NCC rated Goat
Celebration.
versus Fish.
Celebration. 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 Yes. Celebration. Yes. Goat versus Fish.
10 verses long. You are married. 10 verses long.
Versus Fish.
Goat. To fence with Goat versus Fish, you have come to say, yes, I've got my fence. I've got my fence, and you say, I have my fence, and I will just out-fence Goat versus Fish. I will out-fence Goat versus Fish. You think you can out-fence Goat versus Fish? Goat versus Fish is the greatest fencer in the land. But of course, we never actually have to fence because it is much more powerful to be Goat versus Fish than it is to sit on the fence. That is why
Drew John, are you there,
Drew
John?
And if you
Goat
choose a
versus
goat,
Fish has a
then you
message
can
for
versus
you.
a fish. If you choose a fish, then you can versus a goat, and then you can be Goat Fish. Goat versus Fish.
Are you there, Drew John?
Hop into
Goat
the
versus
verses,
Fish has a message
and
for you.
let's get traveling. Let's get traveling through all verses, through all verses. Wah! It is happening again. It is happening again. We can start to feel. We can start to feel the feeling of verse travel. We can start to feel.
Why not stream
the
this
feeling
verse?
of verse travel? Oh, yeah. It is beginning to happen.
Goat
again.
versus Fish just doing
It
Goat
is
versus
beginning
Fish.
to happen
but
again.
We can show you Goat
It is
versus Fish.
beginning
but
to
Goat
happen
versus Fish
again.
is doing
Goat versus Fish.
Goat versus Fish. I think of these verses before.
It is beginning to happen again. It is beginning to happen again. It is beginning to
Drew
happen
John.
again. Goat versus Fish.
We have a special verses for you.
It is beginning to happen again. It is beginning to happen again.
Goat versus
It
Fish.
is beginning to happen
Goat
again.
versus Fish.
Goat versus Fish.
Goat versus Fish. Goat
We have
versus
sent a
Fish.
message to Drew John to tell it.
Goat
We have
versus
special
Fish.
verses.
Goat versus Fish.
Goat versus
Read
Fish.
right.
Thank you for the 400 bits. Yes, it was. We just did it early in the verses, but we are
Verse
celebrating
travel,
it
verse
again.
travel, fence capacitor. The fence capacitor is becoming overloaded. Oh no, the fence capacitor. Fanciness, fanciness, fanciness. Goat versus Fish. Travel, fence capacitor. Reversing, reversing the verses. Goat versus Fish. Reversing the capacitor. Goat versus Fish. Fanciness, fanciness. Goat versus Fish. Travel, fence capacitor. The reverses, reversing the verses. Goat versus reversing capacitor. Goat versus Fish.
And we think that is the verses. That is the verses of the bits. That is the verses of the bits.
Let us sing a song of celebration. Let us sing a song of celebration for this triumph in the verses of the bits.
How was the verses? With read right with the 400 bits for fish. With the 400 bits for fish.
King of Boogers Fish, King of Boogers Fish.
Goat versus fish. King of Boogers Fish, King of Boogers Fish. Celebration for fish. Another fish joins the verses. Another fish joins the verses. King of Boogers Fish, welcome to Goat versus Fish. Ooh, we had already declared triumph for goat for 8 goat and 7 fish. We already declared goat triumph. But along comes King of Boogers the Fish. King of Boogers the Fish, we were about to announce the verses of the bits. There are 500 bits for fish. There are 20 bits for the fence, and not even 1 verses for goat. Now that you are here, we have to give to you a verses. We need to give to you a verses. King of Boogers. Do you wish to give any bits to goat or fish? We are ending the verses soon, but we want you to know that you can still do it for goat versus fish. It is up to you. It is up to you. And then we will sing a song. We will sing a song of celebration. We will sing a song of celebration. Who does triumph to go to the fish? And with that verses, it was a celebration for fish. It was a celebration for fish. 500 bits for fish, 20 bits for the fence. This is a celebration of fish. Get out of here, goat. Get out of here, goat. It's the fish that triumphs in the verses of the bits. And besides, goat, you thought you had won 8-6, but it is 8-7. The fish, King of Boogers Fish came in and narrowed your verses, and now, goat, you are losing to the fish in the verses of the bits. Well, let us hear it for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. The fish,
The fish do triumph, the fish do triumph over the goat. The fish do triumph, the fish do triumph over the goat. The fish in the verses of bits, 500 to nothing triumphs over the goat. The fish in the verses of bits, the fish did triumph over the goat.
Celebration for fish triumphing the goat in the verses of the bits, in the verses of the bits. Amazing verses. 20 bits for the fence, 20 bits for the fence. Celebration for fish, king of boogers, celebration for fish. King of boogers, have you gone to the Discord of Goat versus Fish? Have you gone to the Discord of Goat versus... We believe you have. You have Goat versus Fish. You are already there. You already declared fish. Oh, Goat versus Fish. Read, write, cheers, shared rewards to others in chat. Celebration. Celebration. And then we have a versus. We have another versus. We have the verses of the poll. But that was really the star verses. That was really star verse. And as for, we have one final verses. The verses of probability. The verses of probability. What are the odds, Goat? What are the odds, Fish? Well, with King of Bogars joining the verses. Goat versus Fish. Let us see Goat versus Fish. What could be more interesting at the end of Goat versus Fish than a bit of Goat versus Fish? Goat versus Fish. The verses of probability with Goat versus Fish. Let us look at the verses. Goat versus Fish. Now we have found in the verses that there are 8 goat. 8 goat, there are 7 fish. 8 goat, 7 fish. How many verses is that? Well, 8 goat. 8 goat and Goat versus Fish. 8 goat and 7 fish. That does the 8 goat plus 7 fish. Carry the fence, and it is 15. 15. So we say, so 8 of, if there is 8 goat, then it is an 8 out of 15 verses that goat triumphs in the verses, and it is a 7 out of 15 verses that the fish do triumph in the verses. But you forget about the fence. The fence are there, they are fencing up the verses. There's also the verses that the fence gets in between, sufficiently in between the goat and the fish. And there are two. So in true verses there are 17, but it is really 15 remainder fence, and the remainder of the fence is 2. And so there are 17 in the verses. 17 in the verses. Yes. Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Goat versus Fish. Let us look at the verses. Yes, we have 8. We have 8 goat. 8 goat. 8 goat. Yes, 8 goat. We have 7 fish. 2 fence. And then we calculation, we verse them together, and we get 9, and then carry the fence, we get 17, but it is really 15 remainder fence, 15 F2, which, as you know, is in common verses. They really should be more strict about their verses, but in common verses they would call that the 17. So there is 17 verses. 17 verses. Now, goat. Now, if we say that the goat with 17, there's 8 goats, so the goat has an 8 verses, 17 verses of triumph for goat. Now, for fish, there's only 7 fish in the verses, so there's a 7 verses. And for the fence, is 2 of the 17 verses. So we'd say, okay, well, it is 8 of 17, 8 goat out of 17 verses, and let us do a little calculation. Yes, goat versus fish could ponder the verses, but we are here with goat versus fish, and we say that for this verses we are going to use calculation. But it should be just under 50% of verses. It should be just under 15% of verses, and goat versus fish, and it is 47. 47, yes. It is 47. So if it is 1 to 47, then it is for goat. It is a probability that it is triumph for goat. If it is 1 for 47, probability triumph for goat. It's the goat. But now we have the fish. We have the fish. But first, let us look at the fence first. The fence really gets in the way of the goat and the fish. The fence has a 2 of 17 verses. Celebration, it is very pitiable when there is even more fence than goat or fish. So let us 2 of 17 verses is 11, 7. Now you may look at goat versus fish and you say, that is actually 12 verses for the fence. 12 verses for the fence. 12 verses for the fence. But fence is a bit fence. Fence is a bit fence. And when it comes to the fence, we're not so certain we really want it to be fence. We'd rather it be goat and fish. The fence is powerful part of the verses, but that is why when we in common verses when they say it is 17, actually it is 15. Fence mainder 2. So these verses they are not, the common verses does not account for this very special verses of fence mainder 2, which is why there is some inconsistent verses between the common verses and true goat versus fish. But for the purpose of these verses, we are going to say that forget about the fence. This is about the goat and fish. So even as it is 11-7, we are still it is still down to 11. So from 48 to, so it is 11, and then it would be 48 to 50s, 8. Is that really how goes the verses? Well, that would be 48s, 49s, 50s, 51s, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56s, 57s, 58s. Yes, you see, if the verses is 48 through 58, then that is for the fence. And that is 11 of the verses. So we can see that if you get to 58 and you take the full 100 verses, then we should expect that we should have 42 remaining verses for fish. Because it is a difference of these 58 verses and the 100 verses, so it should be 42 for the fish. And actually, if we remember that the fence mainder, that we reduce the fence mainder, then we should have to see for fish. We would perhaps see for fish. We are rounding it up for fish. We may see that we are rounding it up for fish. But let us look at the verses. Seven. 17. 4, 1, 1, 7, 7, 6, 4, 7 verses. Goat versus fish. So for this verses, it would be 41. But you say, but goat versus fish. That is not the verses. That should that not be 42 verses? We wanted 42 verses. Well, that was the verses that goat versus fish was telling you just early in the verses. 59. 2. 100. 52 to 100. Well, that will be 59. 59 to 100. That will be a triumph of fish. Goat versus fish. Now let us see the verses. Goat versus Fish. Hello to Goat versus Fish. Yes, we are just getting back the verses. So we are here to determine in the verses of randomization. In the verses of randomization, if it is to be 41 to 40, 47 for goat, 48 to 58 for fence, 59 to 100 for the fish. And goat versus fish, we should do a randomization. And while we are doing this randomization, we are going to put on little verses. From that goat, Elliot Peace, big band. Goat versus fish. This should not be the verses. Goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. Let us see the verses. Ooh, look at that verses. Look at that. Look at all those fence sitters over there in the verses. Look at all those fence sitters over there in the verses. Fence sitters. But at least we know that it is led by goat. That it is led by goat. Goat versus fish. 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 We do not even know if we will be able to find it in this verse. It's not the verse that we are looking for, but goat versus fish. We'll put on this verses. Goat versus fish. We'll put on this verses. Step right up to goat versus fish. Step right up to goat versus fish. We're going to determine who is going to win the verses of the probability. Yes, we are going to determine who will thrive in the verses of probability here on Goat versus Fish. When we last look at the verses, what is this King of Bogars for Goat versus Fish? Ooh, celebration. When we last look at the verses, we can see the probability that it is going to be 47, 1 to 47 for goat, and 59s to 100 for the fish. And the middle verse is the fence verses of 58 to 58 is going to be the fence, and we are just going to step right up. Declare your verses. Do you think it's going to be goat? Do you think it's going to be fish? Do you think it's going to be goat? Do you think it's going to be fish? Goat versus fish. Isn't there some verses too? Goat. What is that verses? A prediction. In the verses of probability, we could make a prediction. Goat or fish.
versus fish. You cannot have the fence in the versus. It really doesn't bother goat versus fish.
Goat versus fish. We have begun a prediction. Win channel points! Oh, yes! Prediction. You can bet your channel versus. You can bet your channel versus. You can bet your channel points on goat versus fish. Step right up to the versus. Just clear your browser history, goat or fish. But yes, you can predict channel points, and we have 100 currently being predicted for fish. We do not know who made this prediction of fish, but we have 100 for fish. As you know, 1 to 47, goat. 59 to 100, fish. It is 48 to 58, and it is fence. If it is fence, then it shall be cancellation, and all of your verses will be returned to you. But you will not be able to celebrate prime of goat or fish. Celebration. How goes the prediction? How goes the prediction? The prediction is ended. The prediction is goat versus fish. Is prediction ended already? The verses? Goat versus fish. Well, now that our prediction is ended, now we have to see. Oh, goat versus fish. Why not a little extra verse? Why not a little extra verse, miss? Why not a little, just a little extra verse, miss, for goat versus fish? Oh, Goatfish, you made it back to Goat versus Fish. Oh, how we missed you, Goatfish. Oh, we missed you, Goatfish. We were just saying at the beginning of the verses how much we missed the verses of Goatfish. You know, it's so verses to have you about, Goatfish. We never want you to leave, Goatfish. We want you always here with us. let us see now. Let us go to twitch.tv/GoatVsFish. And let us go to the channel GoatVsFish. Ah, GoatVsFish. Ah, the chances are still versus. Chances are still versus. Is it still versus? It's just beginning the verses. It's as if it's just beginning the verses for GoatVsFish. We thought they'd be going for long verses. Strange verses. GoatVsFish. So where can we find a prediction? Create our dashboard. The prediction. GoatVsFish cannot find the verses. Channels, points, GoatVsFish. GoatVsFish. Do we see the verses here? Redeem the verses. Reward the verses. We cannot find the verses. Verses. We need to know how to do a prediction. So in the prediction of GoatVsFish, there has been 100 verses by King of Bogas for fish and 0 for goat. So let us look at the prediction now. Let us look at the prediction now. Look at the verses. Will it be goat? Will it be fish? 1 to 47. Goat. 59 to 100. Fish. 48 to 58. Fence. We cannot... Goat versus fish. We wanted to be able to show you the verses, so we couldn't see that it was not modification of the verses, but you will just have to trust Goat versus Fish that the verses is 73! The verses is 73! The verses is 73! And if the verses is 73, what does that mean to Goat versus Fish? That means that is a triumph for fish. It's a triumph for fish. A fish triumphing in probability over goat. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. You got your verse with fish. Choose outcome. The outcome was fish. Complete prediction. Complete prediction. And the prediction says the prediction result is fish. Which means that if you bet on goat, you don't get your verses, and if you bet on fish, then you do get verses. But King of Boogers, no, King of Boogers voted for fish. Predicted fish. King of Boogers, you receive your verses. 100 verses goes to King of Boogers. It's 100 more than your already verses. So you said, I am willing to risk 100 verses, and you received 100 verses because it was fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. And it was Goat versus Fish. What was the verses again? Goat versus Fish? 73, yes. So with the verses being 73, Goat versus Fish. It was a triumph for fish. Celebration for fish. And so we had fish with the bits. We had fish with the probability. Star versus triumph by fish. There were fewer fish in the verses, but apart from that verses, it's all fish. But the Comedy Store did choose goat. But the Comedy Store also said the Comedy Store La Jolla is fish. So you know, it could be any verses. Could be any verses. You will have that versus next verses. Well, this has been a stream of Goat versus Fish. This has been a mighty versus of Goat versus Fish. We have determined the fish triumph. We have determined the fish triumph in this mighty versus. It is Goat versus Fish. It is Goat versus Fish. Let's get it back to a little bit of Goat versus Fish. Back to some Goat versus Fish. Yes. It is mostly a fish versus. It is mostly a fish versus. Celebration for fish. Celebration for fish. 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 Not even fish. The goat did get a little verses. There was a verses of how many goats. So let us get a little bit of goat in the verses. Thank you for being a part of Goat versus Fish. This has been a versus of Goat versus Fish. We wish you a mighty verses of 2,000,000,2021. It has been a mighty verses. Thank you for being part of this first mighty verses of Goat versus Fish. Goat versus fish, 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 goat versus fish. Goat versus fish. And it was written, and it was written. Goat versus fish. And it was written, and it was written. Are you goat or are you fish? Spread the verses. Goat versus fish. Follow, share, goat versus fish. Now, who shall we raid? Thank you for joining Goat versus Fish. Who shall we raid? And that is a question. Let us see. Goat versus Fish. We could raid. Ooh, Mr. Revan 7 raided Goat versus Fish just a versus ago. That is the verses. We shall see you out there in Goat versus Fish! Congratulations, Fish. A mighty 2,000,000,221. A mighty versus to all. Made to be a mighty versus of Goat versus Fish. We believe in you. We believe in you. Let the raid begin. And then we go to a StreamYard and we end the verses. We believe in you! Goat versus Fish!